Leech collector. Leech collectors are one set of people who will mostly not anticipate going to work. You see, in 19th century Europe, leeches were used in bloodletting, a medical practice where blood is collected to prevent or cure an illness or disease. So, in the bid to help sick people, these guys would go in search of leeches in filthy waters just to get covered up in blood-sucking leeches, which suck them up and leave painful wounds. They also face the risk of being infected from the leeches and the dirty waters. Whipping boy. Whipping boy is a pathetic job that comes with a blend of blessing and suffering. In early modern Europe, nobody dared punish the prince because of his royal status. So whenever he was to be disciplined, there was a ready substitute to take his place. The whipping boy was educated alongside the prince, and he enjoyed other royal privileges, but they all came at the price of being whipped instead of the prince. This subjects the poor boy to severe physical abuse and pain. Fuller. Fullers worked in the fashion industry, but they sure were in the cleaning department, or you can call it the dirty department. Their job was to clean and process newly woven clothes by soaking it in urine and then stomping on it for long hours to remove the impurities. Doesn't that sound awkward? How did they manage to remove impurities with foul-smelling and nauseating urine? Well, if you're chance to meet a fuller, he'll give you the full gist. Groom of the stool. A groom of the stool is just like a personal assistant to English monarchs, but instead of organizing the king's itineraries and scheduling his many meetings, he attends to more private needs, like defecation. Did you get that? This guy's job is to clean the king's poo. Ew. This guy worked in the royal palace, yet he did one of the most dishonorable stuff. He was constantly exposed to the smelly royal excreta of the king, and he also had to manage the stigma that came with his job. Bone grubber. Bone grubbers were scavengers who fumbled through the dirtiest places to collect animal bones. They go in search of bones in abattoirs or battlefields and then process them into different stuff, like crafting tools and fertilizers. Their job demanded them to endure the foul smell of animal bones and remains, exposing them to infections and diseases. Sometimes, while processing these bones, they injure themselves badly. Mudlark. A mudlark is a guy who scavenges muddy shores and riverbanks for valuable items like metals. Usually, they sold these items to factories that recycled them. The funny thing is, even in this modern era, valuables are still being collected on riverbanks. But with the aid of technology, tools like the metal detector make the work smoother, unlike the mudlark guy, who rakes the mud and dirt with his bare hands, putting himself at the risk of infections. Gong Farmer. A gong farmer should never be mistaken for an agricultural affiliated job, because it is miles apart from it. A gong farmer harvests gong, human wastes usually found in privies and cesspits. Gong farmers would dive into these unhealthy and filthy pits, with their legs buried in excreta to shovel and carry the waste to dispose of them at official dumps. Due to the filthy nature of their work, gong farmers only worked at night. River pig. River pigs worked in the logging industry. They're responsible for guiding logs down rivers to sawmills. This may sound easy, but it is not in any way because of the danger and hazard involved. River pigs would risk their lives standing on floating logs for long hours that can overturn and expose them to the risk of drowning, and also carrying heavy logs that can crush them, exhaust their youthful energy, and leave them as weak elders. Sin eater. A sin eater's job will give you the chills. It's basically spiritual, although it doesn't sound as nice as being a clergyman or a monk. Sin eaters were hired to perform rituals over deceased people. This ritual involved eating bread or any other meal that symbolically represented the sin of the dead in order to cleanse the dead of its sins. This job bore a lot of stigma and made it difficult for sin eaters to lead a normal life, as people saw them as weird and avoided them as much as they could. Rat catcher. Rat catchers had only one job: to catch rats. As simple as that sounds, it was one of the worst jobs one could ever do. You see, these guys were not employed to start chasing rats around the house. They were hired to hunt the rats that infested the old European cities in order to control the damage these sneaky creatures did to food items and the diseases they carried with them. You'll rarely see rats in the open in broad daylight, so rat catchers had to wait till night and visit dirty places like the slums and sewers to locate their targets. And this meant exposure to harsh weather, terrible odors, and diseases. Plague Burier. A plague barrier's job is seasonal. He only gets to work when devastating plagues hit the city. Plague barriers were responding to handling and collecting the bodies of people who succumbed to a disease or plague during its outbreak. Their job was both demeaning and dangerous at the same time. I mean, will be proud to announce to his friends at dinner that he collects dead bodies for a living, coupled with the fact that he also stood the risk of being infected with a disease that killed his clients. That's gross. Matchstick Dipper. A matchstick dipper did one of the most hazardous jobs in history. In this modern era, technology has made it easy for matches to be processed via machines. But in the old time, the job was done by some guys who would manually dip carved wooden sticks into chemical mixtures to create matches. These mixtures usually contained highly flammable and poisonous substances like phosphorus, sulfur, and potassium chlorate. Due to constant exposure to these substances, matchstick dippers stand a high risk of health issues like the phossy jaw, a disease that can only be cured by cutting out some part of the jawbone. Tanner. A tanner's job is highly demanding, both physically and medically. A tanner is responsible for processing animal hides and skins into leather through a process called tanning. This process involved treating the hides with smelly substances like urine and tannin extracts, and then stretching, drying, and sometimes smoking the hides. Tanning involved a lot of foul odors and was relegated to the town outskirts to ensure clean air. Tanners faced constant exposure to foul odors, toxic substances, and infections. Cotton mill worker. Cotton mill workers faced one of the harshest working conditions, especially during the Industrial Revolution era. They were mostly women and children who operated heavy machinery for long hours and faced as they endured deafening noises and heavy vibrations from the machines. Cotton mill workers were also constantly exposed to the inhalation of cotton dust, and the risk of injuries from accidents was high. The worst of it all was that they worked so hard only to get peanuts as wages while sacrificing their health and well-being. Glassblower. A glassblower literally did a hell of a work, as he was constantly exposed to intense levels of heat. Glassblowing involves melting glass and then inflating it using a blowpipe to shape it into various objects. There are too many toxic things to do with this job. First, the unbearable heat that comes from melting the glass. Then, the inhalation of poisonous fumes from the fire. And also, the difficulty attached to manually blowing air into the blowpipe, which can cause respiratory issues. Resurrectionist. Resurrectionists were people with one of the most bizarre jobs in history. In the 18th and 19th centuries in the United Kingdom, anatomists stopped using rats for their experiments and started employing some guys to exhume dead bodies to be used as lab rats. Their operations were mostly hidden, as they were not legal. So if they got caught, they could serve a jail term. Apart from the risk of being imprisoned, resurrectionists also stood the risk of getting infected from exhuming dead bodies. Chimney sweep. A chimney sweep is involved in one of the most distressing jobs in history. Usually, 8 out of every 10 chimney sweeps was a child, and considering the heavy labor they did, they were enduring a lot. They were charged with the duty of cleaning and clearing debris from chimneys. They would climb up narrow and cramped chimneys, even with the intense heat and toxic fumes. And they could suffocate or pass out due to the lack of sufficient air up there. They could even fall off and break their bones if they were not very careful. The risks involved were just too high for children of their age. Snake milker. Snake milker is undoubtedly a daring profession, and it is one of the worst jobs one can consider doing. Just imagine having snakes as your raw material, going around, looking for them just to extract their venom for sale. That's dangerous, right? You see, snake venoms are very useful medicinally, as they are used for antidotes to treat snake bites. But the process of getting these venoms are very dangerous. So there are some guys who have been trained to skillfully milk venoms out of these snakes. This doesn't mean the snake sees them as friends, as these milkers still stand the risk of being bitten by the most poisonous snakes. If I were you, I would never consider being one.